So yeah, thank you so much for this invitation and everyone for being here. It was a fun topic to reflect on, pain points. So I think Agatha, with your introduction, was great. Took a lot of the things that I was going to say kind of right at the start. So I'll just say that, yeah, I do work a lot with kind of community engaged, societally engaged research, participatory citizen science, a lot of overlapping concepts and terms. So that's kind of what I am going to focus on when I was asked to reflect on pain points here. My slides aren't advancing. Oh, there we go. You can still see them?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So just super briefly, when I talk about participatory or citizen science, it means a lot of different things to different people in different contexts. But for me, this means everything from working with really large scale distributed data that comes in from digital citizen science platforms like iNaturalist or in Norway, Artsobservasjoner, that kind of thing. And is often funneled straight into a platform like GBIF and made openly available. Everything from that to like working really closely at the community level with individual people, hands-on training folks, and really, you know, rigorous field-based research and working sort of almost one-to-one with members of the community. That's kind of like the spectrum, and I work sort of all across of this range of things that are meant by citizen science. And so, yeah, the question is like, is that open science? Where does that fit into the world of open science? I would argue that it very much is kind of a part of that conversation, but I'm not sure it's always thought about that way. So I don't know if you're familiar with this figure with the UNESCO four pillars of open science. I'm guessing most have seen this. But I think this is a nice kind of way to break down some of these elements of the open science universe. So I think maybe the first thing a lot of people think of is kind of this open scientific knowledge category where we're talking about data, publications, code, things like that. And then maybe open infrastructures after that. Um, but I do like to highlight when I'm talking about open science that it is often considered that these concepts of open dialogue with other knowledge systems, like interdisciplinary working, working with Indigenous people and local communities and other ways of knowing, that's often also considered to fall under the open science umbrella, as is this idea of open engagement of societal actors with citizen science and participatory science falling into that. So I think that a lot of what I do, I see as open science, and I do like to kind of talk about it that way because I think often it's just not mentioned in those conversations, even if people are doing that and other open science practices, those connections aren't always made. So when I was asked to reflect on pain points, I kind of came up with sort of two angles that stood out to me, like pain points for doing this kind of research that is really societally engaged, but then also pain points for sort of integrating that societally engaged research. Sorry, there's like motion sensors in here. The lights are going to go out periodically, with other aspects of open science. So I just wanted to like briefly throw out some points to consider in both of these areas, and then hopefully we can take the discussion, where you're interested in later. So reflecting on some pain points for doing research that is engaged with society, like citizen science or participatory science in my case, I think the main pain points that came to mind are really like so obvious almost that they can be overlooked, but they really are the big ones. And it's both intuitive and also there's a lot of research that demonstrates and more specifically delineates the nuances of this. So there's time. It just takes a lot of time to get involved in doing this kind of work. And researchers that have a million things going on don't always have the time to really invest in a community and learn how to connect with them and learn how to approach this different way of working. And this also refers to time kind of in a long-term, bigger picture sense, in that doing work that's very closely integrated into a community, often that community can't invest in the work of that researcher unless it's going to be a long-term reciprocal commitment. When you're doing things engaged with the public, for the most part, it's sort of voluntary from their perspective. And so respecting the priorities and needs of those who are getting involved with you in your research is an utmost consideration. And that doesn't always mesh super well with kind of standard funding cycles or the amount of time that you might have on a grant for a project. So time is a big one. Training. Researchers don't always receive training in all of the skills that are involved in working with a community. This can mean community engagement, volunteer coordination, different kinds of specific science communication, meeting facilitation, designing protocols that are suitable to be used by members of the public, and doing the necessary quality control for those, all kinds of things that we don't necessarily learn as researchers who are mainly in an academic system. So that is a really big pain point. And then incentives as well. This work can be slower. It can be more focused on the priorities of a community or participant base and less focused on what's going to be the flashiest research. And so the incentives sometimes don't line up with what career incentive researchers need to be looking at, to attain and maintain job positions. So that sounds a bit kind of gloomy. I definitely don't have advice to overcome all of these things immediately in this talk. But I think when I was trying to come up with sort of the positive side of this, my biggest tip that I wanted to share was that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, start from the ground. You don't have to go it alone. A great thing about the world of citizen science and community engaged research more broadly is that there are lots and lots of open resources available to sort of guide and act as an entry point. And there's a really big, entire field, discipline, multiple disciplines of people who have really professionalized and created effective reproducible systems for doing this kind of work. So you can tap into that, and that really relieves some of the burden of these pain points. So this figure comes from a paper that I got to write last year that was really fun, that sort of explored some entry points, essentially, for researchers to begin working with citizen science, who may not have done so before. There's just a couple things I wanted to point out here. At the top, this idea of planning and evaluation frameworks. This is a huge best practice in the world of citizen science, having really rigorous frameworks and then plans for iterative evaluation of programs in response to research objectives and societal objectives. And documenting this process is a good best practice. So there's often prior citizen science programs, prior groups doing similar types of work that you can learn from with well-documented practices for what they've been doing and what has and has not been effective. At the bottom left, I wanted to mention this idea of boundary spanning institutions and professionals. A really cool thing about citizen science is that it's often taking place across all kinds of different places, sectors of society. You've got programs being co-led by museums, schools, libraries, municipalities, and researchers from academia and elsewhere are involved as well. So across all these different kinds of institutions, there's all kinds of expertise. And the best work is usually done by partnering with those who are really specialized in this kind of community outreach. And that can really ease that burden of the academic researcher having to become a professional in all of these different wide-ranging skills while juggling all their other responsibilities. And then lastly, I wanted to mention this idea of networks for capacity building. Like I said, this is a really big area of research, of professionalism. And so there's all kinds of networks that exist. These are for professional societies that I would recommend looking into if this is a kind of work that you're interested in doing or currently doing. And these are places where there's an immense amount of resources and support and community to tap into to make this a more collective, mutually reinforcing journey rather than lots of researchers sort of individually trying to reinvent the wheel of this difficult kind of work. There's also a number of different publications that are really good kind of guideline starting points. And I've just put 3 screenshotted here that I have really enjoyed in the past that I'd recommend as a starting point for citizen science, but there's many, many more as well. Might skip that. And then, okay, so I do feel like it's not quite complete to leave this point without saying that there's sort of a next level aspect of pain to this, which is that some of these pain points, time, incentives can be tackled on the end of the researchers, but many of them require kind of systems change, and that it would be ideal if we could make academia incentivize this kind of work, if we could create better systems for uptake of this kind of data into governance, things like that. It's not something that I want to take time to talk about right now, but I thought I would just put a couple of references on the screen. It's a really short starter reading list if this is any topic that anyone's looking to dig into on your own a little bit. And then I think the very last thing I wanted to say was this idea of pain points for sort of integrating other aspects of open science into societally engaged research and vice versa. With these barriers of sort of time, training, incentives, like researchers who are trying to do work in a societally engaged way already have a lot on their plate. So adding on other aspects of staying up on other open science practices, that can sound like even more to be considering. The difficulties could feel like they're adding up. Um, so yeah, I wanted to touch on a couple of like synergies and tensions there. So I did want to say that in a lot of areas, citizen science is a real leader in open science. So I mentioned that a lot of sort of dispersed digital citizen science platforms are automatically integrated with some um, data data sharing practices that follow best practices in this area for biodiversity data. That's often integration with GBIF. And this figure is from a paper that I worked on a while back, which just shows like the really astonishing proportion of GBIF data that does come from citizen science. So in a lot of respects, this is really like a success story of two portions of the open science world that are like really nicely integrated with each other. But there are still challenges, and it's certainly not like a done and dusted issue. I point to this paper, for example, that looks at some of the licensing associated with citizen science data and finds it to be less optimal for open sharing than data shared to these platforms from other sources. So there's certainly still more details to dig into and improvements to be made. There's a few other areas I'd point to where citizen science is a real leader in other aspects of open science. It's been at the forefront of producing kind of low cost, DIY, open source research equipment, both physical and digital kinds of tools. And this is sort of driven by necessity to get a whole bunch of the public out there voluntarily collecting data. You need to sometimes equip them with tools and sometimes even provide them with the means to make their own tools. And so they've really been at the forefront of some of this. Likewise, kind of reproducible methods, protocols, evaluation protocols. The field has done a lot to really make materials like this open and reproducible. And then it's a very core best practice within citizen science that data should be shared back with those who help to collect it, both data and kind of summarize results. So that is really a central center to the ethos of citizen science. But then I kind of also identify some areas where there's tensions. And I think the way that I gravitate towards thinking about it is that there are some open science practices can essentially get like stress tested by trying to apply them in the case of citizen science data. Like things that might feel more streamlined when you're talking about processes for making research open and reproducible in an academic setting, suddenly come up with more challenges when you're involving the public. This can be things like data stewardship and sensitivity. If the public is voluntarily assisting with collecting data, they can have a right to have a say in what those data are used for. And it's understandable that they would be concerned that the data could be used for things that are counter to community priorities. If private individuals are involved in collecting data, that data can reveal things about their behavioral patterns, maybe where they live, where they're collecting data. So suddenly there are privacy issues coming into this. And then the idea of making data and research products open really gets tested when you think about who they're open for, like who can access and understand like technically how to use data sets or data tools can be pretty different when you're talking about professional scientists accessing these things versus private members of the public or those who work in municipalities or civil society organizations. So if you're wanting to make research products available to those who help to collect it, this really forces you to think about like what are the actual access barriers? What's the difference between being technically accessible but actually very difficult in practice to access? And then the last thing I wanted to mention was that there can be sort of a tension between data and data products that are relevant like locally and globally. A lot of participatory science is done sort of on a very hyper-local scale to address a community environmental concern. And often that's producing data that are very like customized and difficult to aggregate with any other data. Um, and likewise, sometimes when people are contributing data that goes directly towards sort of large aggregated platforms, it's hard for them to see how this might then be used to support the environment around them. So I think there's interesting work to be done on those tensions, very big questions, but these are some of sort of the core pain points, I guess, that stood out to me when I was asked to reflect on this sort of relationship between citizen science and other kinds of open science. And the main takeaway that I took from this is really that like a societally engaged research can be both an inspiration and also an impetus to refine different kinds of open science practices as we see sort of the difficulties that are hit when we start involving the public in these practices that might feel more streamlined in other contexts. Did want to briefly say, if you're interested in these connections between citizen science and other aspects of open science, there's a couple of places where I would direct you to where there's groups of people interested in these questions working together to talk about them. One of them is the Citizen Science and Open Science Community of Practice, and then the other is the working group in the European Citizen Science Association. So I would point you to those. And then, yeah, I think these are sort of my three main takeaways from reflecting on this question, which was like a very interesting one. So thank you, Agatha, for posing it. I think my first thing was like open science is very diverse all around the circle. Nobody's an expert in all of these things. So I think progress over perfection. Like I've spent a lot of time thinking about these societally engaged elements, but I will happily admit that I'm less strong at some other elements like open source stuff. Like I lack some of the technical know-how that I would really like to have in order to really improve my open science practice there. So, start where you are and branch out from there. And, that's why this is a community and a collective effort for everyone to contribute to advancing different parts of this wheel. Yeah, I like to just emphasize that open societal engagement and other knowledge systems is part of this, and it's more related maybe to the other aspects than is often talked about. And I think it is really good to think of it as that sort of source of inspiration for development in other aspects of this wheel because they are more closely intertwined than they might seem at first. So I think that's what I came up with. Thanks again for asking me to think about these things and looking forward to talk about it a bit more later.
Thank you, Agatha. Thank you also, Caitlin. Very interesting talk. So now it's my turn to give my angle to this question about the biggest pain points of making research reproducible. My name is Anders Kolstad. I work at NINA in Trondheim. Me and Caitlin are actually both in Trondheim, and we're actually almost neighbors. So it's nice that the two Norn award winners were from the same neighborhood. I'm not sure why that is, but something in the air. So work at NINA with ecosystem accounting and developing indicators to monitor the health and integrity of Norwegian ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystems. See if I can switch here. Yeah. And same as there are a lot of ways that you can define open science, like Caitlin broadened our minds with her presentation. There's a lot of ways that you can attack this question about pain points. There's technical things, motivational, institutional. I chose to pick just one to make it a bite-sized presentation. Something which is a bit, if not unique, at least special to what I do normally. And the bottleneck and the problem is funding that I raise now, which can be translated into time, which was also mentioned by Caitlin. But specifically to me, working in a private research institution, a lot of, and with with ecosystem accounting especially, the funding comes from state institutions. So our environmental agency is our main client, customer, if you will. And that's different to a lot of, maybe a lot of you, if you're associated with universities, your main income is through the university with sort of but flexible hours in a way, but all projects through research councils and EU and things. And those two types of money are quite different. So if you have a research idea yourself, you write a proposal, you get it, you can do it from your own head, how you want to solve it. For us, it's a bit different, that the question that we are meant to answer is put up by someone else. And there's a call for someone to find a solution to answer that question, and then make an offer that this is our method to answer your question. And then you get judged in a competition to get the project. You get judged by the how likely is it that you will be able to answer the question, but perhaps mainly the price that you, or the money that you need to answer that question. So very often, this is called oppdragsforskning in Norwegian. There must be a better English term than what I can think of, but it's a bit applied and project-based research. You can fill in if you think of something there. Yeah, very often it's the cheapest, or the cheapest offer that gets the project. And why is that important here? Well, it's because the project is usually short. 1 year is typical, because you have a budget year in state institutions. You have to finish by then. You have to answer the question, and there's no time then to do other things than just to solve the question and hand in the report. So if you add in to your project suggestion that you want to do GitHub repositories with open code review, like I'll be talking about now, you're almost doubling the budget, and you will lose the project. You never get off the starting line. But my talk actually has a positive ending. This is always nice. There's progress on this, not many aspects. The most obvious, I showed this logo a bit too early, so I'll go back. There is focus on open science now, also from the government institutions, in terms of open data, for example. Often they require open data, and a lot of the data that we use is already on GBIF, for example. But I'm more interested in the workflows from the data to the results. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to get different results. Same data, many analysts, you get endless outcomes. So trying to make the reproducible workflows available for scrutiny, that's been my pet peeve in a way. And as we get projects to assess the condition of Norwegian ecosystems, we have found it necessary and beneficial to us to start documenting our workflows better. There's a lot of reasons for that. One thing is specific to ecosystem accounting, is that you have to do it iteratively anyway. You have to do it again in 4 years, 3 years, because that's the nature of accounting. You monitor things over time. And to pick up something that's 3 years old in code, it's like starting from scratch, unless you have really good documentation. So we started as a bottom-up solution, because there is no top-down solution. We're talking 5 years ago now, maybe. There was no funding for this, so there's no top-down incentive to do it. But we felt from bottom-up that it would serve us in the long term, so beyond the current project. And we have 24% sort of flexible time, I guess, at Nina. We have a little bit of leeway. We started with GitHub repositories for these documentations for these indicators that I mentioned. We went through different solutions for code review, for making websites, presenting sort of notebooks. We now have set up with Quarto templates and Shiny app for showing off the workflows. And the solution now has been sort of gone through this branding process. We have a sort of infrastructure. It's called EC Archive, publishing platform for ecosystem condition indicators. Nice to have a name, because you have to sell this later when you try to apply for projects. We produce these workflows as sort of HTML output. So this is a reproducible workflow for an indicator called butterflies. Yeah, so this is something we just did on the side, which is not how science should develop, I think. But anyway, we kind of made it so far that we had a brand name, something that we could sell to our clients in a way. And then the fun angle at the end is that we now, 5 years after starting this route of with GitHub and everything, there was a new call a few weeks ago for a new ecosystem condition assessment for Norwegian mountains and forests. And in the call, which is a screenshot of here, the Norwegian Environmental Agency actually has clearer demands than I've ever seen in a call for this sort of stuff. That it's very small, but above the red line, it says that all the data and all the scripts should be openly available. I've seen that before. The next red line is scripts should be published and on open platforms with opportunity for community review. That's a new name, but it's also a new concept I haven't seen before. And they demand also that the offers for the project budget for code reviewers. And that's a huge cost for code review is very expensive, especially with the work that we're talking about here. So now it's actually top down with funding. So it has flipped a bit around. So it's a good time to be working with ecosystem accounting if you're into open science. And I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take questions around these topics. Thank you very much.